Man insults Caroline Kennedy on a first-class flight. Instantly regrets it when the truth is revealed. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The crisp hum of the airplane engines reverberated through the luxurious first-class cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Among them was Caroline Kennedy, elegantly dressed in a simple yet sophisticated navy blue pantsuit, her demeanor exuding quiet confidence. As she adjusted her reading glasses and skimmed through the pages of her book, she barely acknowledged the tall, broad-shouldered man who stomped down the aisle, huffing under his breath. He was an imposing figure, clad in an expensive but tastelessly loud suit, with gold rings glinting on his thick fingers. His face twisted into a scowl the moment his eyes landed on the empty seat beside Caroline. He shoved his carry-on bag into the overhead compartment with unnecessary force, muttering something about the wrong crowd being allowed in first class these days. The flight attendant's polite voice instructed passengers to fasten their seatbelts as they prepared for takeoff, but the tension brewing beside Caroline was only beginning to escalate. The man, whose name, Michael Davenport, was embroidered onto his custom leather briefcase, let out an audible sigh of exasperation as he flopped into his seat. He barely glanced at Caroline before turning to the flight attendant and gesturing rudely. "Excuse me," he barked, "but I specifically paid for a first-class experience. I wasn't expecting to be seated next to." He paused dramatically, as if searching for the right words. His eyes flickered over Caroline with thinly veiled contempt before he scoffed. "People who don't really belong here." A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the growing tension. Caroline, ever poised, did not flinch. She turned a page in her book as though she hadn't heard him at all. Her silence only seemed to fuel his irritation. "I mean, seriously," he continued, raising his voice. "How do they even let people like you in here? This is first class, not some charity flight." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin, but Michael either did not notice or simply did not care. The flight attendant, a petite woman with sharp blue eyes, inhaled sharply before responding in a calm, yet firm tone. "Sir, first-class tickets are purchased by those who can afford them, regardless of anything else. If you have a problem, I suggest you take it up with airline policy." Michael scoffed but waved her off, his lips curling into a sneer. He turned back to Caroline, who still had not reacted, and laughed humorlessly. "You know, you could at least pretend to look grateful for the opportunity to be here," he sneered. "Instead, you sit there acting all high and mighty, like you're better than the rest of us." Finally, Caroline closed her book, setting it aside with deliberate care. She folded her hands in her lap and turned to him, her expression unreadable. There was a quiet power in her eyes, one that should have been warning enough for Michael to stop. But arrogance had always been his downfall. Before she could say a word, Michael leaned in, lowering his voice to an arrogant whisper. "I know exactly what's going on here. You're some kind of social experiment, aren't you?" His smirk widened. "Let's be honest, you probably didn't pay for this seat. You got upgraded because the airline wants to look woke. Or maybe you're someone's assistant, taking their seat while they sit in the back." A few gasps could be heard nearby. A man in the row ahead subtly turned to listen. The flight attendant, still lingering nearby, clenched her jaw but said nothing for now. Caroline took a slow breath, her patience nearly saintly. But deep inside, something stirred. The ignorance, the entitlement, none of it surprised her. Yet, what was about to happen next would ensure that Michael Davenport would never forget this flight. The airplane had reached its cruising altitude, and the flight attendants began their service, rolling out carts filled with gourmet meals and fine wines. The soft chime of seatbelt signs turning off echoed through the cabin, signaling that passengers could now move freely. But there was an undeniable tension in the air, one that centered around Michael Davenport's condescending remarks. Caroline remained composed, though anyone paying attention could sense the shift in the atmosphere. She was used to handling ignorance with grace, but something about Michael's arrogance demanded a different approach. She exhaled softly, folding her hands in her lap before finally turning her gaze toward him. "You seem awfully concerned about who belongs here," she said, her voice calm, yet sharp enough to cut through his ego. Why is that? Her question, simple yet piercing, caught Michael off guard. He hadn't expected her to respond, at least not like that. Michael leaned back in his seat, scoffing. Oh, come on. It's not that complicated, he replied, waving his hand dismissively. I worked hard to be in first class. I built my company from the ground up, earned every penny of it. So when I see someone who looks like they just don't fit sitting here, I have to wonder, did they actually earn it? He flashed a self-satisfied grin, expecting applause from those around him. Instead, a quiet discomfort settled over the cabin. The man in the seat ahead subtly adjusted his position, clearly listening. A woman across the aisle shook her head disapprovingly. Even the flight attendant, now refilling drinks nearby, gave Michael a brief but telling glance. Yet, it was Caroline's expression that remained the most unreadable. So, let me get this straight, she said, tilting her head slightly. You judge a person's worthiness based on their appearance? Or is it something else? There was a slight edge to her voice now, a glimmer of restrained amusement in her eyes. Michael rolled his eyes, annoyed by her calmness. I don't expect you to understand, he said. People like me, real success stories, we recognize the difference between those who grind their way to the top and those who get handouts. He took a sip of his champagne, smirking as if he had just delivered an undeniable truth. And you, he continued, lowering his voice slightly, look like someone who got lucky. Maybe you married into money. Maybe someone felt sorry for you. Either way, let's not pretend we're the same. He leaned back, crossing his arms smugly, convinced he had won whatever debate he imagined was happening. Caroline, however, didn't flinch. Instead, she let silence settle between them for a few moments, her expression unreadable. Then, she did something Michael did not expect. She smiled. It wasn't an amused smile. It was the kind of smile that one gives when they know something the other person doesn't. She reached for a drink, taking a small sip before speaking again. Tell me, Mr. Davenport, she said smoothly, do you always speak with such confidence about people you know absolutely nothing about? Michael opened his mouth to respond, but something about her tone made him pause. There was something unsettling about how poised she remained, how utterly unbothered she seemed by his words. He suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that he had made a very big mistake. But he had no idea just how much, because in just a few moments, he would learn exactly who Caroline Kennedy really was. The tension in the first-class cabin had thickened like a storm cloud. The clinking of fine china and the murmurs of conversation continued around them. But for Michael Davenport, the world was starting to shrink. His arrogance had led him into unfamiliar territory. And though he was too stubborn to admit it, something about Caroline's unshakable composure was unsettling. He could sense the subtle shifts in the people around them. Passengers who once ignored their conversation were now stealing glances. Their curiosity piqued. The flight attendant, who had earlier tried to defuse the situation with neutrality, was now standing just a few feet away, listening intently. Something was about to happen, and for the first time, Michael wasn't the one in control. Caroline adjusted her seat slightly, her gaze never wavering. She exuded an effortless elegance, the kind that didn't need to be announced or proven. She let the silence between them stretch just long enough for Michael to feel it before she spoke again. Mr. Davenport, do you know what I find fascinating? She mused, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with men like him. People who mistake privilege for merit. You talk about working hard, about building your success, but what you really mean is that you benefited from the right circumstances, the right connections, and the illusion that your way is the only way. She let the words sink in before adding, but let's test that theory, shall we? Michael chuckled, though it was thinner than before. Oh, this should be good, he said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Go on, educate me. He leaned back, arms crossed, still smug, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. Caroline took her time before answering. You see, I do belong here, Mr. Davenport. In fact, I belong in places far beyond this cabin, in rooms and discussions that determine the course of history. She reached in her bag and retrieved a small, unassuming leather case. With calm precision, she opened it, revealing an official identification card. She held it up, turning it just enough so that he and the growing number of onlookers could see. The name printed on it, in bold, unmistakable letters, was Caroline Kennedy. And below it, the emblem of the United States government. Michael's smirk faded instantly. He blinked, his brain struggling to process what he was looking at. The name, Kennedy, as in that Kennedy. The realization hit him like a freight train. Caroline Kennedy wasn't just another first-class passenger. She was American royalty, the daughter of John F. Kennedy, one of the most iconic presidents in history, a former U.S. ambassador to Japan, a diplomat, author, and philanthropist with more accomplishments than he could count. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him with brutal force. He had spent the last 20 minutes patronizing and insulting one of the most influential women in the world, a woman who had spent her life shaping policy, representing her country on the global stage, and carrying the weight of a legacy that defined modern American history. Michael swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. I didn't realize, he stammered. Caroline smiled, gracious, but unmistakably victorious. No, she said, you didn't. A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin. The realization had settled in like a lead weight on Michael Davenport's chest. The arrogance that once dripped from his voice had vanished, replaced by something unfamiliar, humiliation. His mind scrambled for a way to salvage the situation, but there was no undoing what had just happened. He had insulted Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of a U.S. president, a woman whose last name alone commanded respect across the world. He wasn't just rude, he had exposed his ignorance on an international stage, and the audience was growing. Passengers who had once politely ignored the conversation were now fully engaged. The man sitting ahead of them turned slightly, pretending to adjust his seat while eavesdropping. The woman across the aisle arched an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her champagne as though watching a scene from a movie. Even the flight attendant, who had remained neutral up until now, was giving Michael a look that could only be described as satisfaction. Michael cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. Miss Kennedy, he began, his voice shakier than before. I didn't mean any offense. I just assumed. Caroline tilted her head slightly. You assumed, she repeated, her tone measured but pointed. And what exactly did you assume, Mr. Davenport? Her eyes held his unwavering, waiting for him to say it out loud, to acknowledge the truth behind his own prejudice. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His bravado had evaporated, and now he was left with nothing but the uncomfortable reality of his own words. He had judged her, not on her accomplishments, not on her merit, but on his own narrow expectations of who belonged in first class. And now, he was paying the price for it. I didn't recognize you, he admitted, grasping at straws. If I had known, Caroline let out a quiet chuckle. If you had known, you would have treated me with respect, she asked. Tell me, Mr. Davenport, does a person's worth depend on their name, their title? Or do you believe that everyone deserves dignity, regardless of whether they fit into your idea of success? Michael opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in his life, he had no words. The flight attendant, sensing the shift in the conversation, stepped forward. Ms. Kennedy, would you like another drink? She asked, her voice smooth, professional, but with the slightest hint of amusement. Caroline nodded graciously. Yes, please. A glass of red wine. Michael, desperate to regain his footing, turned to the flight attendant as well. I'll have... Actually, the flight attendant cut him off, her smile polite but firm. We're out of your preferred selection, Mr. Davenport. A few passengers smirked. Michael clenched his jaw, realizing that he had officially lost this round. Caroline took a slow sip of her wine, her composure never faltering. It's a shame, really, she mused. You had so much to say before. And yet, now that you know who I am, you suddenly seem quiet. Michael swallowed hard. He had come onto this flight thinking he was the most important person in the room. But now, sitting next to Caroline Kennedy, under the silent judgment of an entire cabin of witnesses, he realized the truth. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. The once boisterous Michael Davenport now sat in silence. The energy he had radiated when belittling Caroline Kennedy had completely drained from his body, leaving behind nothing but embarrassment and discomfort. He glanced around, noticing how the atmosphere in first class had subtly changed. People weren't just ignoring him anymore. They were watching him, judging him. The realization made his skin crawl. For once, he wasn't the most important person in the room. The soft hum of the engines filled the silence between him and Caroline. She had returned to her book, effortlessly unbothered, as though their exchange had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. But for Michael, it was anything but. He felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. Powerless. And worst of all, he knew he had done it to himself. His ego screamed at him to fight back, to find a way to regain control of the situation. But for the first time in his life, he had no argument. The facts were undeniable. He had judged Caroline based on nothing more than his own assumptions. And now, his ignorance had been laid bare for all to see. It wasn't just about who she was. It was about who he had revealed himself to be. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the awkwardness. "Listen," he began, his voice lower than before, careful. "I think we got off on the wrong foot." Caroline turned a page in her book, barely acknowledging him. Michael shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention from other passengers. "I didn't mean any harm," he continued, forcing a chuckle as though trying to make light of the situation. "I was just, well, you know how it is. First-class flights. You never know who you'll run into." Caroline finally looked up, her eyes meeting his, but her expression was unreadable. "Is that so?" she asked coolly. Michael nodded, desperate to smooth things over. "Yeah, I mean, I just wasn't expecting someone like you to be." He stopped himself, realizing, too late, that he was about to make things worse. Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" she repeated, her tone polite but dangerous. Michael swallowed hard. "I just meant, I didn't recognize you." Caroline exhaled softly and placed her book down. She had given him ample opportunity to reflect, but clearly he still didn't get it. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Davenport," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Would you have treated me with respect if I were someone else? If I didn't have a famous last name? If I weren't a diplomat or an ambassador?" Michael hesitated. He knew the answer. I didn't mean to offend," he muttered, suddenly feeling suffocated. Caroline leaned back in her seat. "But you did," she said simply. "Because the problem isn't who I am. It's that you believed you had the right to determine whether or not I belonged. And the irony is, Mr. Davenport, that's exactly why you're the one who doesn't belong here." Michael felt the words hit him harder than expected. He had spent his entire life believing that he was the one who defined the rules, that success meant power, dominance, control. But for the first time, he wasn't in control at all. Caroline was. And worse, she wasn't even trying. The flight attendant returned, this time with an unmistakable smirk. "Mr. Davenport," she said, her voice just a little too sweet, "I just wanted to let you know that the captain has approved an alternate seat for you back in economy." A few passengers chuckled softly. Michael's face burned. "Economy?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The flight attendant nodded. "It seems there's been a mistake," she said, though the twinkle in her eyes suggested otherwise. "We wouldn't want you feeling uncomfortable sitting next to someone who, as you put it, doesn't belong." Michael clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the armrests. This was a nightmare, a first-class humiliation, and there was no way out of it. Caroline picked up her book once more. The conversation was over. Michael had spent his life judging others. But today, he was the one being judged, and for the first time ever, he regretted every second of it. Michael Davenport sat frozen in his seat, his face burning with humiliation. Economy? The word echoed in his mind, a brutal reminder of his downfall. Just minutes ago, he had been lecturing Caroline Kennedy about class, status, and who deserved to be in first class. Now he was being told to leave. The irony was so sharp it felt like a blade against his ego. Passengers were no longer just watching. They were enjoying the spectacle. A few exchanged amused glances, while others looked at him with thinly veiled satisfaction. He had made a show of himself, and now he was the show. The flight attendant, still smiling, gestured toward the aisle. "Mr. Davenport, your seat in economy is ready," she said, her voice oozing with politeness that barely concealed her amusement. "We wouldn't want to keep the other passengers waiting." Michael's jaw clenched. He wanted to refuse, to argue, to insist that he had every right to stay in first class. But deep down he knew he had lost. The airline had made their decision. And Caroline? She wasn't even looking at him anymore. She had dismissed him, just as easily as he had dismissed her earlier. Slowly he stood. His expensive suit, once a symbol of his power, now felt cheap as he adjusted his jacket. He grabbed his briefcase and took a deep breath, preparing for what he knew would be the longest walk of his life. As he stepped into the aisle, the humiliation hit full force. First-class passengers stared, some whispering, others smirking. He could hear the murmurs, the barely contained laughter. "Guess money doesn't buy class after all," someone muttered. "Talk about instant karma," another whispered. Michael kept his gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the stares. Each step toward economy felt like a public execution. The curtain that separated first class from coach suddenly felt like a barrier between worlds, one he had been forcibly removed from. When he finally reached economy, the contrast was jarring. The wide, plush seats of first class were replaced by cramped rows and tired passengers who barely looked up as he passed. The air smelled different, less like imported wine, more like reheated meals. This wasn't his world. The flight attendant pointed to his new seat, a middle seat in the last row, right by the bathrooms. Michael nearly choked. "Enjoy the rest of your flight," she said with a saccharine smile before walking away. Michael sat down stiffly, his knees pressed uncomfortably against the seat in front of him. His seatmates, a mother with a crying baby on one side and a man aggressively chewing gum on the other, barely acknowledged his presence. He let out a slow breath, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had spent his life looking down on others, and now he had never felt smaller. Michael Davenport sat stiffly in his new seat, a middle seat in the last row of economy, wedged between a restless baby and a man whose chewing gum popped in rhythmic bursts. The space was cramped, suffocating, a far cry from the spacious luxury he had taken for granted just minutes ago. The armrests were narrow, forcing his elbows inward, and his knees pressed uncomfortably against the seat in front of him. For the first time in a long time, Michael Davenport felt insignificant. He tried to compose himself, forcing deep breaths to keep his temper in check. But the reality of his situation was impossible to ignore. He was no longer the powerful businessman in first class, no longer the man who dictated who belonged and who didn't. Instead, he was just another passenger, forced to endure the same discomfort as everyone else. The crying baby to his left squirmed, letting out another sharp wail. The exhausted mother, barely glancing at Michael, muttered an apology. "Sorry, he's teething," she said, bouncing the baby gently. Michael gritted his teeth and forced a nod. His first instinct was to lash out, to demand peace and quiet, but after everything that had happened, he bit his tongue. His situation was no longer one where he could command control. He had been stripped of that power, and for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand what that felt like. As the flight continued, the whispers from first-class passengers echoed in his mind. "Talk about instant karma. Guess money doesn't buy class after all." Their words burned into him, forcing him to reflect. His humiliation wasn't just about being moved to economy. It was about why it had happened. He had made assumptions. He had judged someone based on nothing more than his own prejudices. And worst of all, he had been so sure he was right. Now, with his pride in tatters, he was forced to ask himself a question he had never considered before. What if he had been wrong this whole time? The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting the cabin. A flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, advising passengers to keep their seatbelts fastened. Michael clutched his armrest as the plane shuddered, his mind still spinning. He thought back to Caroline Kennedy, still seated comfortably in first class, her poise and confidence unshaken. She had never raised her voice, never lost control, and yet she had completely dismantled him, not with insults, but with grace. She had allowed him to dig his own grave with his words, patiently waiting for the moment he would realize just how foolish he had been. And now, that moment had arrived. Michael exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He had always believed that money and power determined a person's worth. But sitting here, stripped of both, he was starting to understand something he had never acknowledged before. True worth isn't about wealth. It's about character. And in that department, he had come up empty-handed. For the first time in years, Michael Davenport felt ashamed. The hum of the airplane engines filled the economy cabin, a stark contrast to the hushed luxury of first class. Michael sat uncomfortably, his thoughts swirling with the events of the past hour. He had spent his life believing that status dictated respect, that wealth defined a person's worth. But now, stripped of his privileges, he was forced to confront a painful truth. He had been wrong all along. The crying baby beside him finally dozed off, his tiny fingers curling against his mother's shirt. The exhausted woman exhaled a breath of relief, shifting carefully so as not to wake her child. For the first time, Michael really looked at her. She wasn't just an inconvenience, a seatmate disrupting his peace. She was a mother, struggling through the same challenges as everyone else on this plane. Something in him softened. I know this flight hasn't been easy for you, he muttered, his voice quieter than usual. If you need any help, let me know. The woman turned, surprise flickering in her eyes. That's kind of you, she said, offering a small smile. Not everyone is patient when babies cry. Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Not everyone, including me. As the hours passed, he listened. For the first time in years, Michael stopped talking and started observing. He watched as the flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, tirelessly attending to requests. In first class, he had barely noticed them, treating them as mere conveniences rather than people. But here, in economy, he could see the effort behind every polite smile, the exhaustion behind every, "Can I get you anything else?" He saw passengers helping one another, shifting seats to accommodate families, offering tissues to a man who had sneezed, sharing snacks with a child who had finished his meal too quickly. There was a quiet camaraderie here, something he had never paid attention to before. Wealth had isolated him, made him arrogant. But humility? It connected people. For the first time, Michael understood why Caroline Kennedy had been unfazed by his insults. She wasn't defined by money or status. She was defined by her values. She had known something he hadn't. Respect is not something you demand. It's something you earn. And he had spent his entire life getting it wrong. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent. Michael exhaled deeply, his thoughts heavier than ever. This flight had begun as just another luxury experience, another opportunity to revel in his own success. Instead, it had turned into something he never expected, a lesson in character. And though the plane was about to land, Michael's real journey had just begun. As the plane descended, the golden hues of the sunset painted the sky outside Michael's window. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, not because of the seat he was in, but because of the weight of his own actions. He had entered this flight as a man convinced of his own superiority, only to be confronted with a reality he had spent his entire life ignoring. He had judged, he had assumed, he had looked down on others, and in the end, he had been the one left humiliated. The landing gear extended with a soft hum, and the plane jolted slightly as it prepared for touchdown. Michael swallowed hard. His old self, the version of him that thrived on power and control, would have dismissed everything that had happened. He would have blamed the airline, blamed Caroline Kennedy, or even blamed bad luck. But for the first time, he didn't look for excuses. He had been wrong, and he needed to face it. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Michael remained seated for a moment, staring at the seat in front of him. He had never felt the need to apologize before. His money had always smoothed over any offense. But this time, money wouldn't fix what he had done. Taking a deep breath, he finally stood, grabbing his briefcase. As he stepped into the aisle, he saw Caroline Kennedy just a few rows ahead, still effortlessly composed as she waited for her turn to exit. Her presence felt even more powerful now, not because of who she was, but because of how she had handled herself. Michael hesitated. Then, before his pride could stop him, he took the first step toward humility. As they exited the plane into the bright, bustling airport terminal, he found her again, walking toward her destination. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he quickened his pace and caught up to her. "Ms. Kennedy." She turned, her expression unreadable. Michael cleared his throat. He exhaled sharply, struggling against the instinct to defend himself. Instead, he forced himself to simply own it. "I was wrong." Caroline studied him for a moment before responding. "About what, exactly?" Michael swallowed. "About everything." His voice was quieter now, stripped of arrogance. "I judged you without knowing a thing about you. I assumed things that weren't true. And I acted like an ass." The corners of Caroline's lips curled, just slightly. "I've spent my whole life thinking that money and power make a person important," he admitted. "But today, I realized that character is what really matters." She nodded slowly. "And what do you plan to do with that realization?" Michael hesitated. It was a good question, one he didn't have an answer to. Yet. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But I know I don't want to be the man I was when I boarded that flight." For the first time, Caroline's expression softened. She extended her hand. "Then maybe this was the most valuable flight you've ever taken." Michael took her hand and shook it. For the first time in his life, he felt truly humbled. Michael left the airport feeling different. The weight of his past arrogance sat heavily on his shoulders, but for once, he didn't try to shrug it off. He embraced it. His encounter with Caroline Kennedy had shattered the illusion he had built around himself. That evening, instead of retreating into luxury and ignoring the lesson, he did something he had never done before. He reflected. He replayed the flight in his mind, analyzing every moment, every assumption he had made. How many other people had he dismissed in his life? How often had he let pride outweigh decency? For the first time, he wanted to change. Michael's transformation didn't happen overnight. He still struggled with the urge to prove himself, to maintain control, but now he saw those tendencies for what they were, weaknesses, not strengths. A week after the flight, he did something unimaginable. He reached out to Caroline Kennedy. A simple email. No excuses. No justification. Just a sincere acknowledgement of his mistakes. To his surprise, she responded, "Growth begins with humility. I hope you use this lesson well." Michael read the words several times, letting them sink in. He had spent his whole life believing he had nothing to learn from others. Now he realized learning was the only way forward. Months later, Michael found himself in a completely different situation. This time, he was at a business event, watching a young entrepreneur nervously introduce himself. The man was clearly brilliant, but lacked the confidence or connections that Michael once believed defined success. Old Michael would have dismissed him. New Michael? He listened. He encouraged. And when the opportunity arose, he opened a door for him, without expecting anything in return. As he walked away, he thought back to that first-class flight, to Caroline Kennedy, to his downfall, to his rebirth. For the first time in his life, Michael Davenport was no longer trying to prove his worth. He was finally becoming worthy of respect. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.